A couple of weeks back, I embarked on the first camping trip I've been on for a while, being myself primarily a city dweller, always yearning for nature like I'd experienced in my youth, yet remaining bound in harsh city luck by work and circumstance. The place I stayed at was Knob Noster State Park, a relatively small area of mostly undisturbed forest and prairies in the otherwise barren state of Kansas, typically covered by farmland and looking mostly like a brown grid of irrigated dirt from satellite view. Getting away from home was a nice change of pace and allowed me a small reset on my frantic mind state, as well as a break from my obligations. On top of merrily gathering sticks despite the no down to wood sign, the abundance of gnats and various other painful insects on the trails, and a harrowing experience with some special mushrooms, I found myself startled, amazed, and a bit unnerved by the sheer density and scale of it all. Nature seems to have this tangible looming presence. The vastness of the Osage's woods is downright unsettling, seeming at any moment as if they'll swallow you up and leave you buried. Stumbling out of the tent, I consider my trepidation as I waded through thistle and underbrush barefoot, the film of chilled sweat on my legs making me feel like a wet newborn. I harshly lost my footing and stumbled dick first into a craggy ditch, landing halfway between a rotting raccoon carcass and a large patch of poison ivy, and in that moment, desperately gulping humid air and squinting with tears in my eyes at the overhead sun, I was thinking of video games. The grass claws at me and consumes my flesh as my sweaty palms grip the sides on my Xbox 360 controller. Beads of boiling sweat fall from my busted chin as I put a pair of Turtle Beach headphones in my fragile skull. My hair is matted, and with blood welling below my tongue, a fear of God in my soul, and a squirrel clinging to my leg, I know. It's gamer time. I recall that Carl Sagan once said that to appreciate how a cake was made, one must start at the beginning of the universe. So, in order to appreciate how we got to this, we'll start by going back to this. The first appearances of forests in video games can be found during the first appearances of video games themselves. Colossal Cave Adventure had this. Contra had this. Are you a bad enough dude to lay shirtless in grass? Forests were difficult to replicate with such young technology, so most games of the era stuck to the vast, featureless blackness of space, the simple, robust geometry of the great indoors, and only occasionally attempted, with vigor, to convey that mean green and all of its verdant glory. Duck Hunt managed to capture a still shot of two trees and a horizon in all their 8-bit majesty, but you could hardly label it a forest. Now watch as I grip on the segue like a half-pipe and nose grind over to The Legend of Zelda, 1986, whose playing area is undoubtedly supposed to be a forest, yet makes no real effort to flaunt it, placing rocks and bushes very matter-of-factly in wide open spaces. Much like how games such as The Last of Us might place an unlikely smattering of broken down cars in a vacant lot to provide cover during a firefight. Sure, it doesn't make total sense when you look at it that way, but big fucking deal. It's not what they were going for. Still, the looming sense of unknowingness here is very much present, and I am detecting a very small hint of the terror I might feel when in an actual bona fide forest. The game's basic layout kind of manages to capture that feeling of everything seeming normal until you look too closely and discover something horrifying like a gross, old man living in a dingy cave. What's that guy doing in there? 1991's A Link to the Past gives away, thanks to an extra 8 bits, to a frankly gorgeous portrait of a world in perpetual decay, whose forests are in flux with the powers that govern the realm, granting a mystical connection between the forest and the game's themes. With the added perspective given by the civilized towns, passing into the wilderness feels just as it should. Exciting, foreboding, a feeling of uneasy descent and immersion into something greater than yourself. Oh, that omnipotent golden power in all of its holy elements. It seems to reverberate through the swirling mist as Link presses on, squinting through his special little eyes at a third dimension that we're simply left to wonder at. However, the two dimensions we do see are utilized to great effect. The more complex layering capabilities afforded by the superior SNES gives the graphics a depth that had never been felt before in the series. I'd say it pops out more, but it's more like it sinks into your TV screen, like a flattened diorama of sorts. Also present are distinct footpaths that imply the presence of feet other than yours having been there, and provide a satisfactory explanation as to why you can access certain wooded areas but not others. Walking off the beaten path would be not only painful and difficult, but just plain dumb considering how dangerous even the path itself is. Silhouette shading on scattered tufts of grass gives the land texture without looking too grid-like or procedural, thanks to the ground floor itself being baby smooth in a cleverly stylized sort of fashion. Visible flora denies classification, being more a cartoon caricature of real life than anything else. Yes, you can't expect expect to open a book on botany, say, and start cross-referencing plant species, but only nerds do that. Yes, seeing the world map as a whole sort of kills the illusion knowing that the forest you're in is just a few dozen trees, but on ground level, it's daunting by early 90s standards. The landscape features several types of grass, elevated rock formations serving as paths, some non-forest biomes exhibiting their own unique features, numerous unique ground covers, and just in general, a commendable amount of organic structure, defying and disguising its strictly grid-based engine. There's even shadowing on the ground from the tree canopy in places, way beyond what could ever be accomplished before. This shit rocks. You could smoke a fucking cigarette to this shit. This shit makes me bust hard. This fucks. 2 years later, Donkey Kong Country fucked hard with its forest, with atmosphere unheard of, and parallax up the donkey ass. As a side-scroller, the density and detail packed on screen here is superb, with a memorably gorgeous color palette making each background object surge in aesthetic unity. The nighttime levels are particularly tasty to the eyeballs, with moonlight painting the treetops in a pale bluish arrangement. A year later, Chrono Trigger's more painterly backdrops make a righteous juxtaposition when compared to the simple sprite work of A Link to the Past, showcasing just how much difference an all-star crew of hyper-talented auteurs can make when given the ability to emphasize spectacle over gameplay. Even on the same piece of hardware, this game takes the torch and does an acrobatic fucking pirouette off the handle with it. The forests in this game take form not as a mass of individual sprites comprising a greater whole, but more of a slurry of carefully placed pixels coalescing into something that looks like a true work of art, rather than a digital playground for infants. The landscapes here are textured to an infinitesimal degree that I could only possibly attribute to witchcraft. The forests are murky, winding, paying tribute yet holding no candle to the effortless, formless beauty of nature herself. Trees are clustered sporadically in a pleasing and beautiful fashion, the paths you take through them seeming incidental, offering free reign on the X and Y axes instead of being suffocatingly linear like many of Square's other games.
The game's playing itself, John. The game's playing itself, John! The game's just playing!
It makes you worry about getting lost, it really does, although finding your destination is never made into a frustrating ordeal. Nitpicking specific details becomes more difficult for me as a writer when the game world is seen as a whole entity instead of a calculated array of sprites on a screen. Composition is the priority here, with surroundings sort of closing in to form a natural frame around the player and the action. The view is top-down, technically speaking, but the illusion of an angled view in the art offers a lot of depth and extra visibility, with players disappearing behind trees rather than below them as they would in A Link to the Past. Traversal is often difficult, but in a good way. It almost seems as though this all happened by accident, and you weren't necessarily meant to traverse these environments, even though you were literally meant to traverse these environments. They don't so much make a way for you as much as they allow you to wander through them, aided by diegetically placed human constructions such as bridges and ladders, as mankind alone cannot possibly hope to conquer the land itself with mere hands and feet. Canopy shadows now stay in place rather than following you around like they did in A Link to the Past, which is a great aspect of a feature that could have been easily forgotten or simply left out. Also note how sunlight is cast on character sprites as well as their surroundings. In areas where torches are present, nearby surroundings may be bathed in a warm, radiant gradient, breathing salient life into the darker areas in your extraneous radius, nullifying dark strangeness and simultaneously taking away its alienness. As any epic adventure should, the game has a huge variety of different types of forests to explore, immediately recognizable and distinct, with each one somehow looking even more cash money than the one before it. Environments are even subtly animated in certain instances, with flowing water, rustling leaves, and grass rolling with the wind to make it all feel like the real deal. I'm frankly glad I decided to make this crazy ass concept for a video into reality, just so I could go back and rediscover the insane level of detail put into this game's landscapes. At first I expected the retro section of this video to be a footnote, but we're already 1,300 words in and I'm barely getting started. Dude, there was 3D in the 90s even! This was an age of primitive experimentation at first, with low poly counts and confounding new tech, limiting developers from around this time to a sort of novel playing field. It's gotta be my favorite era visual-wise, if only for nostalgia's... Can you shut up? It's gotta be my favorite era visual-wise, if only for nostalgia's sake, but was it a good time for realistically rendered forests? Fuck it, there's gotta be at least one that holds a candle. I'm gonna talk about Ocarina of Time now, obviously. What was the first thing that came to mind when I started thinking about video game forest levels, before I even began to write the script? The legacy of the Lost Woods is evident without preamble. Its trappings are small, claustrophobic, boxy, ugly by today's standards. It's essentially just rectangles, and its structure doesn't owe itself to exploration so much as it serves a purpose in that particular part of the game. However, the way it serves the atmosphere and narrative is another thing. This package opens up on a healthy bit of mindfuckery by way of the puzzle with the singing holes, evoking mystic folklore vibes. The way the forest seems to be a living thing, luring you in with its music and breaking the very laws of reality to keep you guessing is a really cool concept, and it'd be great to see more games employ similar ideas. It's a bit spooky, which is honestly how I already feel about Forest after having sat down in them for long enough, pondering in horror at what must actually be at play there. Using cold, hard facts and logic like a real gamer, anyone can realize that the first room is just the second room, and the third, but the message is received. The forest is fucking with you, and that's a bit scary. How can something that takes up so little space and looks so unassuming leave such a lasting impression on the gaming hive mind? It's all about the feelings it gives off, man, and those feelings are bad ones. Walking into a forest feels strangely welcoming during the daytime, in my weird personal opinion. I usually feel honored to be nipped at and given diseases by the insects in them, like I'm being judged on my merits as an animal and a source of food, disregarding my ties to society, culture, and technology. It treats you indifferently as it would any other creature, as if you always belong there. You fit right in as predator and prey, but when night falls, things feel a bit different. Making a spectacle of yourself in the woods at night makes you feel a bit unwelcome, and not being able to see any of the lurking animals that might easily be able to see you is a bit unnerving. That's more so the vibe I get from this forest, that I'm being watched at all times. After pressing on, despite the beginning area letting you know loud and clear that you're not welcome, as you continue it becomes suddenly obvious that the forest isn't fucking around anymore. Werewolves attack with a rabid fervor, honestly still scaring the shit out of me to this day. That's a lie. On that short trip to the temple, it's clear that the forest doesn't like you, and I appreciate the interplay of elements that build upon that feeling. That's all. Given the small scale of the level itself, there's not too much more to say. Tomb Raider's Lost Valley is notable for imbuing more dynamic elements into its atmosphere, such as waterfalls, sparse flora, and ancient human architecture, giving it a wild, reclaimed quality. As pioneering in the 3D realm accelerated in the late 90s, we saw PC technology afford devs more room to work with and make forests in, which is what graphics were invented for after all. Under the guise of a pitch black ceiling and heavy atmospheric fog born of technical strangleholds, venturing into the depths of Lara's scraggy underbrush left 1996 gamers dripping with salty sweat from intimidation and arousal. Taking a small step forward, temporally speaking, brings us through space and time to Final Fantasy X, one of my favorite RPGs of all time, if not one of my favorite games of all time. I game hard with this. This game fucks, and its forest fucks hard. Ocarina Forest is home to impenetrable scores of trees. Even when scaling their massive branches, you can't quite break the surface. You can't escape. The overall scene sports a color palette of luminous fluorescent blues, deep purples, and mossy greens, thanks to its bioluminescent features and moonlit-stricken ground. It's a visual feast, serving up a staunch competition to the tangentially related Chrono Trigger, with the shared talent speaking for itself in the humble way that Square used to play by back in the day. It's a tad swampish, with the soil under your feet mixing into an oily sludge reminiscent of an abstract watercolor piece, and the game's unwillingness to allow you off the beaten path is forgivable since Tidus's outfit and hair wouldn't fare too well in the marshy conditions. It's this very unwillingness that's always afforded Square to invent such huge seeming environments, as opposed to Esward Rim, wherein the province demands your suspension of disbelief with its tendency to scale down its environments into a technically manageable space, creating an uncanny scaled down dollhouse effect. Final Fantasy has always been a series to simply show inaccessible areas in the background, leaving the player to just acknowledge that they'll never be able to go there, although it does look awesome. Rather than creating a town with 10 buildings of which you can explore all of, the series keeps you within a small area of a huge city, with the implication that if you lived in its world you could go anywhere. The same applies with forests in these games, although I am frustrated that I might never be able to see more of this than what was allowed. Ignoring all that, you seriously owe it to yourself to pick up the HD remaster and experience Macalania for yourself, along with all the other gorgeously crafted areas this game has to offer. Getting into heavy hitter territory, Metal Gear Solid 3 enters the competition swinging, with an utterly brutal rendition of Russia's remote wildlands. The forest winds through rough-hewn stone hallways, leading you through an expertly arranged set of woodland habitats, putting extra emphasis on the darker, more dangerous aspects of nature. The ruthless operatives hunting Snake are accompanied by gnats, crocodiles, snakes, bees, precarious footing, relentless conditions, and a somewhat grimy and occasionally unsightly appearance. This is crucial, seeing as how the game has you crawling on your Chinese a lot of the time, it's important for you to be able to easily imagine all the bugs that'd be crawling up your asshole. In this example, the forest is once again itself a gameplay mechanic, but a cleverly integrated one that doesn't compromise its aesthetics. While owing to many dangers, the dense ground cover provides ample subterfuge throughout the stealth sections, and the forest at large is Snake's only means of survival, with the eating of snakes and all that. It feels dirty and just nails the visceral experience of actually being in a forest in a way that none of the other games mentioned so far could quite accomplish. And unlike some of those other games, a sizable bulk is spent crawling through it. This is where it all takes place. You feel like you'll hardly ever get away from it, and when you do, it almost feels relieving. The game is chock full of humanity, as any Super Bunny hop could tell you, and your investment in its characters is heightened in a significant but easily overlooked way by all the time spent rooting around in the recesses of the forest, alone and shit scared. Hiking the Appalachian Trail might leave you savoring every moment you spend away from fellow hikers, while a trek in remote hostile wilderness is likely to do exactly the opposite. During our 3-day camping trip, my boyfriend left on several occasions to visit a nearby Walmart. Even on the campground after the weekend getawayers vacated and left the place a bodiless void, our only company was the raccoons trying to steal our food, and even then we only saw them at night. Anyways, the believability here is severely bolstered by an array of technical feats, such as the sheer amount of complex geometry crammed on screen, water reflections that were way ahead of their time, and a hearty helping of that sickly yellow bloom that games of the time were so fond of. The forest envelops you like a wrathful mother, looming at every second, bathing you in water, dirt, darkness, and fear. Snake gets wicked primal, journeying through pitch dark caves, a soul torch being the only thing standing between him and certain death, in a place that his species was never meant to occupy. This is as much of a story of man versus nature as it is man versus man, and it never quite lets you forget that. As every breathing, living second, you're being nipped at by everything around you, confounded by the lawless disorganization of the land, dilapidated buildings embodying the temporary nature of mankind's playthings in the face of nature, infinite, undying, consuming. Yet, despite of all this, nothing breaks the snake. Moving on, Ubisoft's 2004 problem child Far Cry offers up something completely different from Metal Gear's cursed bogs, and brings us to the sweeping vistas of a sun-bathed South Pacific archipelago, boasting a huge fucking big-ass forest. One that doesn't so much immerse you in itself as it does look pretty in the background, but the craft here still has to be mentioned. By nature of its wide-open playing area requiring a stripped-down, conservative approach to level crafting, Far Cry can seem a bit quaint-looking compared to its more linear spiritual successor Crysis, but the loving gaze it casts on its oceanic setting is still felt deeply, and let's not forget it was, and still is, a technical marvel. The CryEngine makes possible an impeccably dense forest teeming with color and personality, and although you won't find too many opportunities to stray from the coast and military structures this game likes to confine you to, during those moments when you are actually in the meat of the island, it's really special. On land or reviewing the region, your immediate area seems to fall off after a certain point, the high altitude mountains in the distance granting the visual field a dizzying sense of scale, not moving that much when you walk towards them in that horrifying way that mountains seem to do. However, when it comes to rainforests, you have to hand it to Crysis. The game's stark, true-to-life lighting casts an eerily familiar glow on the meticulously crafted areas in this game, and while linear, what you are allowed to walk through has a lot to share with you. Touching down on the island, you're blinded by a moonlit tree line, disallowing you to gain your bearings and leaving you no option but to venture into the great unknown. It's a stellar way to introduce the player to the playing field, having them stumbling dick first into it as their first gameplay task, with the previously seen aerial view not doing much to give you an idea of what to expect on ground level. I don't know about you, but I strongly advocate the idea that graphical fidelity is an integral component of game making, and I can't think of many better examples than Crysis. Even today, the beauty of it is face-meltingly awesome. Digital Foundry did a better job of running the game's visuals through a modern lens than I ever could, but I'll attempt it on my own and short for posterity's sake. Because of course, before this point, games could never hope to have achieved this level of fidelity, so it'd be silly to just gloss over it. Heavy implementation of expensive PC-grade global illumination makes for a consistently stellar light show, with large areas being canvassed in dark shadows, painting the brilliant landscape in a stark chiaroscuro fashion, in opposition to Far Cry's cartoonish, more flatly shaded forests. Shadows are cast not only by large objects, but by everything down to the individual leaves on trees, consistently remaining true to life and ensuring that one would never need to squint to appreciate the whole picture, for fear of encountering missing shadows or other unsightly artifacts. Ground covers are seen practically everywhere, up to a fall-off distance that's rarely noticed during gameplay, and the ground itself is littered with grass and plants of an extremely high level of fidelity, all meshing together, clustering without looking segmented, constantly affected by breeze, explosions, gunshots, and the player's own movements. Tree canopy shadows are rendered in real time, as are most things, with high quality stippled spot shadowing, not only in areas wherein one may find canopies above them, but also under just regular old trees outside of the forested areas. Falling leaves give an air of life to the forest as you walk through it, or more often sprint through it at inhuman speed with sinewy robot legs. Enemies are a bit difficult to make out at times thanks to how obscured everything is by trees. For all I know, they could have built the forest before they ever even considered how gunfights might work in them. I'd have a really hard time trying to envision how these uncannily natural seeming areas could have ever been designed first and foremost around enemy encounters. Even so, the unpredictable nature of the terrain makes for some pretty interesting gameplay, affording you more options for subterfuge, sneakery, and camouflage than any blown out military outpost ever could. There's also something to be said here for the clash between sci-fi tech and the natural world, evoking a sort of magical realism that harkens back to films such as Predator and Avatar. Oblivion's province of Cyrodiil is home to a wide range of organically distinct fauna, flush ferns, ground covers, natural rock formations, and several unrealistically spaced but painterly looking biomes. All of nature's wrath is put on display, yet it nary seems wrathful, instead opting for a gentle and charming aura, with a soft, vibrant art style reminiscent of being outdoors on shrooms. A program plane that feels stunningly real for its time thanks to processing shenanigans and an eye for aesthetic, yet lacking in teeth to a degree. Sparse, pleasant, smooth, and procedural feeling to a forgivable extent. It avoids the death traps that many modern games fall into despite their budgetary advantages, skewing around micro mishaps such as Far Cry 3's plastic patina, Skyrim's shameful foothill mountains, or every geological feature being made into a toy version of its real-life counterpart in order to save on resources. Oblivion's forests could accurately be called mild. They're welcoming, unsuspecting. They lay their secrets out on relatively level topography and obscured by tree lines, but when generously viewed as an abstract representation of a forest, simply doing what is possible within the confines of a game engine, it's not too bad. Attention to detail is paid in spades, as can be seen on striped patterns of large rocks hinting at a clear sedimentary origin. While the series' somewhat alien plant species have make-believe names, their appearance is almost universally indicative of a real-life counterpart. For instance, the fly Amanita species of mushrooms is a dead ringer for its real-life cousin, Amanita muscaria, colloquially referred to as fly agaric in the West, known for being the inspiration for the iconic Mario mushroom. The fly Amanita grows exactly where you'd expect it to in reality. Its appearance is distinctively Amanita-inspired, and even the effects gained from eating it are true to real life. Its burdening status effect makes sense since Amanita muscaria, when consumed, is highly physically taxing, given the ibotenic acid's nature as a drug of the depressing class, on top of being a deliriant capable of producing brain zaps. Viking berserkers of 9th century Scandinavia were theorized to have eaten them for their frenzying effects before charging into battle, so the agility and health buffs call back to reality as well. It's all accounted for and is pretty cool to see, myself having been a fan of mushrooms and mycology for quite a while. The Elder Scrolls series' freakish devotion to pre-established lore tidbits ensures that plants, fungus, and tree species behave consistently, making it difficult to find too many faults in the construction of Oblivion's natural environments, beyond clipping geometry and faults born from a large but still limited team and budget. Man, those are some cool forests. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty satisfied. Let's look at some more forests. Finding a worthy one-upper to Crysis' foliage and fauna is a daunting task. You'd think that 14 years of graphical advancement and consumer bickering would provide some leeway here, but simulating a true-to-life forest must be pretty hard given how many other games fall flat. Dark Souls might be my second, possibly first favorite game ever existing in Infinity, but its comparatively weak sequel has a shitty excuse for a forest level that always kinda pissed me off. Accessible through this central hub area and seeming to be almost a wedge between these two impossibly close together pathways to other areas, the Forest of Fallen Giants exists in a non-Euclidean quagmire. Not a quagmire in terms of the soil, but in its awkward, nonsensical placement in the world, sitting right next to several areas that it almost seems to be paradoxically occupying the same space as, and just generally not providing any real sense of location relative to anything else. Just getting to the place, you've already come down with a sort of uncertain fever, wondering where the fuck you even are at this point, and upon approaching the first clearing, you're hit with yet another wave of disconnection because because it looks like ass. It's quite literally a hallway with a slight bend, with a river running through it and two patches of dry land on either side. One, a haphazard indentation that exists solely because a bonfire needed to be placed somewhere. The ground is alright, caked with moss and dotted with red leaves that oddly enough don't match any of the nearby trees, but it's helped little by the crisscrossing window pane thin bushes and occasional fern that the developers threw in. The grass just sort of sticks out of the floor geometry in loose coalitions, not quite full-bodied enough to be accurately called tufts. The rocks, some mossy and some inexplicably not, blend and clip somewhat triangularly into their adjacent meshes, although they do a decent enough job of filling space. They seem to have crumbled from the surrounding rock walls, but stay conveniently out of the way of the action, lest they distract from the dull, brown-looking scenery on display. The river here is the focal point composition-wise, although it's hardly remarkable and doesn't really go anywhere. It straight up flows directly into this rock here, not under it or anything, just into it. You don't get much of a feel for the surrounding area until you scale the nearby fortress, and once you do, the sight is just laughable. There's trees growing out of rocks. Somebody put that there and decided it was okay. I'd make the case that the game might not even be trying to craft a forest here, because it doesn't seem like they tried to make it look like one, but it's in the goddamn name, so what am I supposed to do here? Can a river between two broken down buildings be classified as a forest? A forest is defined by Wikipedia as a large number of trees covering a relatively large area, but I don't know if this number is large enough to be considered large, since there's maybe a dozen. The trees themselves look like something out of a slapdash Fallout New Vegas mod, rather than professionally designed game assets. I'm gonna go ahead and just call this not a forest. Man, shit-talking Dark Souls makes me feel bad. Let's move on. I know I made a whole other video gushing over it several years ago, but Far Cry 3, despite its charms, never really impressed me with its forests. The leaves and grass just sort of have this plastic sheen to them that I was never able to get over the look of, and the crude implementation of this murky, hideous ambient occlusion is especially ugly when looking at grass. Furthermore, if you choose to disable the effect through .ini fuckery, the grass loses depth completely and just ends up looking flat and weird. The forests look impressive from afar since this engine is great with distance rendering, but when you're in the forest itself, it's just lame. While vibrantly verdant, the grass is homogeneous and uniform in appearance, a bit procedural looking. It's everywhere, covering most of the territory indiscriminately, and is all pretty much level in height, whereas real grass tends to grow taller in deeper areas where rain pools. You don't see any real variation until you gain access to the second island, whose grass is just more unhealthy and brown looking. When you get up close to the ground, such as while skinning an animal, it becomes painfully obvious you're looking at low-res copy and pasted sprites, with the actual ground texture having this ugly facsimile of three-dimensional grass sticking up, which just seems a bit pointless. The abundance of weeds and bushes helps, but the shading on shrubs, for example, leaves a lot to be desired. The leaves on certain trees look paper thin, lacking depth and distinguishable form beyond simply existing. It gives the impression of being something you're not supposed to look at directly, which is odd considering how much time you spend wandering outside in this game. On a surface level, it's not that bad. My main gripe with this one is how you can never seem to find anywhere remote. There's always a road within walking distance, and there aren't any particularly large, isolated forest areas, so once again, it's hard to even call these forests in the first place. As a side note, this is more of a Far Cry issue than a Far Cry 3 issue. I also felt that 4 and 5 left me lacking a bit, not as much in the raw visual departments, but more so in the structures of their forests and how inescapable the roads and outposts were. Grand Theft Auto 5 paid a great amount of respect to its wildland areas, dedicating a huge portion of the map to them and even imbuing its nature with its own lore and mysteries, with the Mount Chiliad business harkening back to Rockstar's previous antics such as the Statue of Liberty from GTA 4. It begs for investigation, but sadly, every time I found myself packing my bags and going out to see the Great Wide Open, I'd come out on the other side a few minutes later wondering where the hell the wildland was supposed to even be. Even with all that space the area takes up on the map, the landmarks begin to repeat themselves pretty frequently if you drive or fly through the area too often, and when taking a magnifying glass to it, the individual assets are kind of low quality. One of the more interesting techniques for crafting digital worlds that's shown its head in recent years is the process of photogrammetry, wherein many photographs are taken of the same area from different angles, and a 3D scanning technology is used to translate those photographs to digital assets. While now accessible to everyone with a smartphone or computer, the tech has a history of use in games spanning back to 2011 2011's L.A. Noire, and was put to effect most notably in The Vanishing of Ethan Carter and Star Wars Battlefront, the former of which is well known for its implementation of a very cool technique. Despite humanity's ingenuity, even the most skilled 3D modeler would crumble in the face of nature as an artist. A forest modeled by hand is a copy, a mere reproduction, while a true forest believability is implicated by ages of topographical history. Every individual part of a given ecosystem is tied to every other part of that ecosystem. Erosion, animal activity, tectonic shifting, weather conditions, and natural disasters experience perpetual and endless synergy, acting upon each other in ways that we might not be able to make out without arduous study, but in ways that we can feel just from looking at it. While this video may seem trivial or stupid to some, those who value video games as an aesthetic experience will understand how important it is to poke and prod at these sorts of things, especially on a platform like YouTube, not only to increase awareness of this even being a topic of interest, but to influence the mainstream and raise attention paid towards game facets that aren't often given enough attention. Forests are an essential part of our geological heritage, covering around 30% of Earth's landmass and being a popular setting for many games that might not understand how to pay proper respect to the natural order. When I play a game like Final Fantasy XV, whose alleged forest is woefully barren and minuscule, looking like a plain compared to the concept art, I can't help but shed a few tears comparing it to the love shown to the war-ridden battlefields, urban hellholes, and brutalist concrete mazes that this medium is so strangely attached to. For the longest time, creating outdoor maps was a daunting task, thanks to trees and such being relatively difficult to render without a conundrum performance-wise. Yet more and more often, as the war between the technological singularity and the law of diminishing returns wages on, game companies are getting braver, wiser, and more attentive towards their treatment of forest environments, thanks to capable engines and tireless workforces. It's important to shine a light on the forests that deserve praise, to raise a shit about the ones that don't try, and to examine the shortcomings of ones that don't quite make the cut. As Shigeru Miyamoto once said, "A great game with a bad forest may be great forever, but the forest will still be shit for the rest of all time." You may not remember that the forest was shit, but I will. Oh my god, I care way too much about this.